Welcome everyone, Christine here with my essential unit guide for the Chaos Dwarves, as well as Lord and Hero choices for them in a campaign. Now, starting with the Lord choice, generally speaking, I would argue that the Overseer as a Lord choice is the superior one. The reason is, he can get a fairly substantial benefit when it comes to hobgoblins, or he can get other substantial campaign benefits that the Sorcerer Prophet just simply doesn't have. Plus, he is a pretty powerful melee lord that is going to do quite well in battle, that you just don't have in terms of a hero option, whereas you do have a hero option to make up for the lack of magic with regards to the Demon Smith Sorcerer, who's basically going to fill the same role. And usually speaking, I'm not too fond of using magic on lords. The reason is, with lords, you want to obviously get a lot of army skills, but you still want the magic. So having a dedicated hero for magic is generally the smarter decision. And it isn't really that difficult to increase hero capacity as the Chaos Dwarves when you're playing their campaign. Otherwise, then yes, you do want to get the Bold Centaur Tarok, and you do want to get the Infernal Castellans. The Infernal Castellans are kind of useless in battle, but they're obviously pretty damn useful on the campaign map because of the campaign movement range. Bold Centaur Taroks can be pretty solid in battle. In terms of priority, I would argue like there's probably some equal priority between a Demon Smith Sorcerer and an Infernal Castellan, because obviously the magic benefit is pretty substantial, and of course the campaign movement range is also very, very substantial, whereas the Tarok just gives you less benefits in general. Now, when it comes to the units, starting from Tier 1, from any Tier 1 settlement, you can get Orc Laborers. And basically, when it comes to recruiting laborers, you should only recruit them if you have literally no other choice. Like, if you have the ability of recruiting hobgoblins, which you can do at Tier 1, then recruit hobgoblins. If you just don't have the ability to recruit anything and you're trying to emergency recruit, then yes, obviously orc laborers will do. But generally speaking, they're not worth using otherwise, except in an emergency situation. That's it. They're basically a two-handed version of the Orc Boys. They don't have the armor, but they do have a fairly substantial amount of HP. And crucially speaking, they have a two-handed weapon attack. So if they're going up against other early game infantry, they will win a lot of those confrontations early on in a campaign. But generally speaking, if you're playing the Chaos Dwarves, what you'll want to do is start getting Hobgoblins, Sneaky Gits, and Hobgoblin Archers as quickly as possible in your campaign. The Sneaky Gits win out in general. The reason is they have poison attacks, they have that bonus versus infantry, they have Vanguard deployment, they can fire while moving, they have that precursor weapon. They're the better unit to use overall. And they do have stock, so they're actually capable of surviving ranged attacks because the enemy won't see them to shoot at them initially. Obviously, they're more vulnerable than the shielded version, but the damage they do will more than make up for that, especially with the poison attack and the poison precursor weapon that they do have. Then we have Hobgoblin Archers, which are actually going to be your frontline range unit early on in your campaign, as you're obviously going to be struggling with unit capacity when it comes to the Chaos Dwarf units in your campaign. So Hobgoblin Archers are decently effective. They're just, like, the way I see these guys is they're just a slightly better version than Goblin Archers, though obviously they do have those flaming attacks, but effectively view them the same way that Greenskins view the Goblin Archers, and that's what Hobgoblins should be used for. Then you do have the Hobgoblin Wolf Riders. The reason you should get a couple of Wolf Riders, like one or two in every army, or maybe even more, maybe even a spear version, but the reason you should get at least two of these guys, typically speaking, I'm not too fond of getting a lot of cavalry unless cavalry is good. But the reason you want to get these guys is Skirmisher Cav. So one of the things you can do as Chaos Dwarves is play in a very defensive way, like corner camp, or just warm up in a defensive area. And sorry, I'm losing my voice very slowly over here. But the thing about Wolf Raiders with bows is that you can use these guys to, Vanguard deploy them close to the enemy, and lure the enemy into attacking your prepared positions. That's the role one or two of these units will have in your army roster. I would not use more than that, but just 1 or 2 can be pretty useful. Now, moving on to the Chaos Dwarves themselves, and obviously you do want to get Gordouz. Just to mention this about Gordouz as a legendary hero, he's actually not necessarily best suited to being in your main army, because your main army is probably going to have the best unit, so it's probably going to have a bunch of Chaos Dwarves, whereas Gordouz really buffs the Hobgoblins and gives them a significant amount of benefit. So you might be better suited to take Gordouz and put them in a secondary army as opposed to your principal army. That would be the way I would use him when it comes to a campaign. But when it comes to Chaos Dwarves, I would argue that Chaos Dwarf Warriors, the shielded version, is really the one you want to go for. They have a silver shield, they have a good amount of armor. It's the same principle as the Dwarves. Like, you really don't want to use the two-handed version of these guys, because while obviously the armor piercing is beneficial, having that kind of silver shield makes them an incredible sturdy front line. Like, the way the two-handed version operates is in similar manner to the regular Dwarves, in that they trade away the shield for a bunch of armor-piercing damage, and I don't think that's really worth it. If you're gonna get Chaos Dwarf Warriors, get the shielded version. It is the better choice. And same principle applies to the Infernal Guard. When it comes to Infernal Guard, yeah, picking up the shielded version is better than the two-handed version, unless you're like dealing with chaos, unless you're in that specific situation where you're dealing with a lot of chaos units, then, or heavy melee factions, then yes, it might be worth it, but most of the time you're going to be dealing with quite a lot of range factions on the campaign map as the Chaos Dwarf, so having Infernal Guard with shields is the better choice. And of course, the natural progression with that is to get Infernal Ironswarm. Now, talking about your Chaos Dwarf range units, obviously Blunderbusses and Infernal Guard are really powerful units. There's not much really to talk about. Both of them actually can be used throughout the course of your campaign. The benefit of the Blunderbusses is that they actually do more damage than the Infernal Guard. Obviously, they're nowhere near as good, but they do have that silver shield, whereas the Infernal Guard with Fireglaives do not. And they do a significantly higher amount of damage. And what I find with gunpowder units is that the best kind of units that you can use when it comes to gunpowder prowess is to have a unit like the blunderbusses, which are, yes, they're short range, very short range, but do a significant amount of damage with every shot, and this actually may make them more useful. However, don't underestimate the sheer power that Fireglaves do have, because they're one of the most powerful ranged units in the game, but unfortunately they're a gunpowder unit, so they obviously have some limitations, and they're also pretty solid in melee because ultimately they're still Infernal Guard. Moving on to artillery, I mean, if you're recruiting tier 2 artillery, then obviously magma cannons are probably the go-to, and Iron Demons and all that, but it is pretty easy to get to tier 3 as the Chaos Dwarves. They do need to save up on some materials. And once you get to tier 3, I'd argue there's only 2 units you should bother with at tier 3. And you could get some Skull Takers if you want to have the Wall Breaker ability, but otherwise they're kind of useless. But those 2 units that I'd use would be the Death Shrieker and the trusty Hell Cannon. The reason the Hell Cannon wins out against other artillery pieces, obviously Dreadquake Mortars in the late game are really, really powerful and you should get them, but you're not going to have a lot of Dreadquake Mortars until much, much later on. We're talking tier 5 units, and I think like talking about tier 5 units, like obviously they're very expensive, they're limited, and you're not going to use them throughout the course of most of your campaign. Like later on, yeah, it makes sense, get the tier 5 units, but until that point, Hell Cannons are the better choice. The reason Hell Cannons and Death Shriekers win out is for this reason. Most of your artillery pieces share the same unit cap, with the exception of the Hell Cannon. This is an advantage to the Hell Cannon because it means you can get a lot more Death Shriekers and Hell Cannons together in your armies and your campaign if you're having that split cost. Because, well, obviously early on it might not feel as an advantage. Later on, as the cost increases on unit caps, it does end up being an advantage. And also, to be clear, they both benefit from increasing the unit caps to any artillery unit, so both of them are going to get the same upgrades at the same time. So, from my perspective, getting Hell Cannon capacity and getting Death Shrieker capacity is probably the best decision over here. Like, Death Shriekers are pretty good in both siege and field battles. And obviously Hell Cannons are great overall. Like, Hell Cannons have one of the best projectiles in the game, I'd argue, because it's not a cannon. One of the problems with the magma cannon is, yeah, sure, if it hits like a truck, but the problem is a lot of time it will fire very slowly. Hell cannons are more reliable to actually make use of in battle. And then finally we have the Kadai Fireborn. Obviously Kadai Destroyers are worth using, but you might ask the question, well, why aren't you using Bull Centaurs? If you're playing Astrogoth, obviously getting Bull Centaurs for his army is worth it. But generally speaking, Bull Centaurs, the problem with Bull Centaurs, while they're really good units, they're very, very difficult to unlock. And you got to think about the economy of scale. Like, you got to think, okay, how many units do I want to unlock in my campaign? What's going to be more worth it? And I will argue very strongly that going for Kadai Fireborn is the smarter decision for a couple of reasons. One, the upgrades that you're getting for Kadai Fireborn will also apply for Kadai Destroyers, which means that these units, well, which may not be as good, though they're still very strong as well. Like Bull Centaurs might be a better unit in some respects, but these guys are still very, very strong. And crucially, as you're getting these unit upgrades that apply to these guys, you're also getting unit upgrades that will eventually apply to your Kadai Destroyers that you're getting later on in your campaign. So units don't exist in a void. They don't exist in an isolation. They exist within the context of, like, okay, are these upgrades, are these skills as well? Because I'm pretty certain the Lord skills as well, the way they're structured, they apply to both of these units. So you want to have an army that you can upgrade later on, or the path to upgrades is a natural one. If you decide to go for Bull Centaurs, you could, and it, as I said, it is worth it with Astrogoth, because he is really, really powerful with the Bull Centaur Doomstack, but that is the exception, not the rule. I'm not saying Bull Centaurs aren't strong, because they are very, very strong, but so are Kadai Fireborn and Kadai Destroyers. And if you go with Kadai Fireborn, eventually you'll unlock the upgrades as you increase their unit capacity. You will unlock the upgrades for Kadai Destroyers, which will make them far more powerful in battle. That is my perspective on the issue, because that's ultimately the decision you have. Like, both the Kadai units and the Bull Centaurs, they kind of have the same role in terms of these big monstrous units that will just annihilate units in battle. And I think, like, overall, while it's certainly the Centaurs are powerful, it just makes more sense when you're building a massive empire to go for the Kadai units. Though keep in mind, they are demons, so they do have the downside in the sense that once their leadership goes down, once their HP goes down, they are going to get completely obliterated in a battle. So that is the downside, but this is where a Demonsmith Sorcerer or multiple Demonsmith Sorcerers work out, because they do have the ability of healing them, of reforging them with the reforged skill. So it just ends up working pretty well. Like, they're pretty powerful. They're decently fast. They have a good relatively good leadership, relatively good stats as well. And that is it. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.